30 seconds. That's all it took to break into the most secure computer system in the world. 30 seconds to prove that my sister's life was worth more than every classified secret the Pentagon thought they were protecting. And 30 seconds to show everyone who had ever called me a computer nerd exactly what those skills could do when someone I loved was about to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started. 3 days before I became the most wanted and most celebrated hacker in America, depending on who you asked. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was debugging code in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Millbrook. No subject line, no greeting, just an attachment that made my blood run cold. It was a ransom video, grainy and dark, showing my sister Natalie tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Her usually perfect blonde hair was disheveled, her designer clothes torn, and there was fear in her eyes that I'd never seen before, not even when we were kids and she'd sneak into my room during thunderstorms. "If you want to see your sister alive again," the distorted voice said, "you have exactly 72 hours to transfer $50 million to the following cryptocurrency wallet." The screen flashed a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to most people, but everything to someone like me. Any attempt to contact law enforcement will result in her immediate execution. We know you have the money, Ms. Sterling. We've done our research. That was the first shock. They knew my real name, not the fake identity I'd been living under for the past 3 years. Jade Sterling, former cybersecurity specialist for the Department of Defense, current freelance web designer hiding in plain sight. The second shock was the amount. $50 million. They somehow knew about the cryptocurrency fortune I'd accumulated through, let's call them, gray area activities during my time with the government. I stared at my reflection in my laptop screen, seeing a woman who looked nothing like the confident hacker I used to be. At 28, I'd spent the last 3 years deliberately making myself invisible. Oversized hoodies, no makeup, thick-rimmed glasses I didn't even need, hair always in a messy bun. I'd perfected the art of being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. It was safer that way. You see, 3 years ago, I didn't just quit my job at the Pentagon. I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. A backdoor in our own defense systems that could only have been placed there by someone with the highest level clearance. When I tried to report it, suddenly I was the one under investigation. Suddenly my security clearance was revoked. Suddenly I was persona non grata and the only world where my skills meant anything. So I disappeared. Moved to Millbrook, a small tech hub city where I could blend in among the hundreds of other 20-something programmers and developers. I told everyone I built websites for small businesses. I lived in a tiny apartment, drove a beat-up Honda Civic, and let people think I was just another struggling coder who never quite made it to the big leagues. The only person who knew the truth was Natalie, and she'd never believed it anyway. Computer skills, she'd called them, always with those air quotes and that condescending smile. "Jazz, you fix my laptop when it freezes, and you built that cute little website for Mom's flower shop. That doesn't make you some kind of cyber warrior." Natalie had always been the golden child. Stanford MBA, corner office at Meridian Financial in Millbrook's downtown district, penthouse apartment, designer, everything. She was everything our parents had wanted both their daughters to be. Successful, visible, normal. While I'd spent my teenage years in basement computer labs and online forums, she'd been homecoming queen and valedictorian. While I'd been recruited by the government straight out of college for my unique talents, she'd been climbing the corporate ladder the traditional way. "You live in a fantasy world," she told me just last month when I'd tried to explain why I couldn't help her with some simple cybersecurity issues at her company. "You act like you're some kind of secret agent or something. But Jazz, you're almost 30 and you're still building WordPress sites for flower shops. Maybe it's time to grow up." That conversation had ended with her storming out of my apartment, designer heels clicking angrily against my cheap linoleum floors. We hadn't spoken since, and now she was counting on those same computer skills to save her life. I read the ransom message again, my fingers automatically running through the digital forensics checklist I'd memorized years ago. The email had bounced through 17 different servers across 12 countries. The cryptocurrency wallet was newly created, untraceable through conventional means. The video metadata had been scrubbed clean. These weren't amateurs. Whoever had taken Natalie knew exactly what they were doing. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that the boring, invisible woman in the oversized hoodie was just Natalie's underachieving little sister. They had no idea they'd just declared war on someone who had once been codenamed Ghost in Pentagon briefings, someone who'd infiltrated foreign intelligence networks before she was old enough to rent a car, someone who'd spent 3 years hiding, not because she couldn't hack anymore, but because she was too good at it for her own safety. I looked at my setup, 3 monitors, custom-built tower with enough processing power to run a small country, and networks of contacts that most people would kill for. In the corner sat the black duffel bag I'd hoped I'd never have to open again, filled with hardware that officially didn't exist and access codes that had supposedly been deactivated when I went dark. 72 hours to save my sister. 72 hours to prove that everything she'd dismissed about me was not only real, but more powerful than she'd ever imagined. 72 hours to show the world that sometimes the quiet ones in the oversized hoodies are the ones you should fear the most. I cracked my knuckles and pulled up my terminal. It was time for Ghost to come out of retirement. But first, I needed to find out exactly who had been stupid enough to take a Sterling, because while Natalie might not believe in my computer skills, she was about to find out that when you threaten family, those skills become something much more dangerous. They become weapons. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They called me Ghost for a reason. Not because I was invisible, though I'd perfected that art by now, but because I could slip through digital walls like they didn't exist. Firewalls, encryption, multi-factor authentication, air-gapped systems that were supposed to be unhackable. To me, they were just puzzles waiting to be solved. I wasn't always hiding in a studio apartment in Millbrook, pretending to build websites for local businesses. 5 years ago, I was the youngest senior cybersecurity analyst in Department of Defense history. I had a corner office in the Pentagon, level 4 security clearance, and a reputation that made foreign intelligence agencies lose sleep at night. My specialty wasn't just breaking into systems, it was doing it so cleanly that no one ever knew I'd been there. While other hackers left digital footprints, I moved through networks like smoke, gathering intelligence and closing vulnerabilities before our enemies even knew they existed. The Secretary of Defense once called me the most dangerous woman in America, and he meant it as a compliment. But that was before Project Nightfall. Before I discovered that someone with the highest level of government access had installed backdoors in our most critical defense systems. Before I realized that the same networks I'd spent years protecting were compromised from the inside. Before I learned that some secrets are too dangerous to know, even for someone with my clearance level. When I tried to report what I'd found, suddenly I was the problem. My access was revoked pending investigation, my colleagues stopped making eye contact, my supervisor, Colonel Hartwell, suggested I take a voluntary sabbatical while they reviewed my concerning behavior patterns. Translation, shut up or disappear. I chose disappear. But disappearing when you're Ghost isn't as simple as just walking away. I'd seen too much, knew too many classified protocols, had access to too many state secrets. The kind of knowledge that makes people nervous, the kind that makes accidents happen to inconvenient former employees. So I'd had to die, professionally speaking. Jade Sterling, Pentagon cybersecurity specialist, suffered a complete nervous breakdown and quietly resigned from government service. She moved back to her hometown, developed severe social anxiety, and became a recluse who barely left her apartment except for grocery runs and the occasional coffee shop visit. It was the perfect cover. Who would suspect the woman in oversized hoodies who could barely make eye contact with baristas was the same person who'd once hacked into the Kremlin's private servers just to prove it could be done? The hardest part wasn't the isolation or the constant vigilance. It wasn't even having to use just a fraction of my abilities, building simple websites when I could reshape entire digital infrastructures. The hardest part was watching my family worry about me, thinking I'd lost my mind or my ambition or both. They thought I was broken. They thought the woman who'd once briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff had become a failure who couldn't handle the real world. And I'd let them think it, because it was safer for everyone if they believed I was harmless. But now, staring at that ransom video, safety wasn't an option anymore. I opened the black duffel bag I'd hidden in my bedroom closet, the one Natalie had seen a dozen times and assumed contained old college textbooks. Inside were devices that looked like ordinary laptops and smartphones, but contained hardware modifications that could break through security systems the way a sledgehammer breaks through glass. Signal interceptors that could tap into satellite communications, portable servers with enough processing power to coordinate digital warfare. And in a sealed envelope at the bottom, a list of emergency contacts. People who'd worked with Ghost. People who owed me favors. People who could help me find Natalie. If they even remembered who I used to be. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out my old encrypted phone, the one I'd promised myself I'd never use again. 3 years of silence. 3 years of pretending to be ordinary. 3 years of letting the world think Jade Sterling was just another washed-up government employee who couldn't cut it in the private sector. But some skills don't fade, some instincts never die, and some people are never really gone. They're just waiting for the right reason to come back.
As the phone powered up for the first time in 3 years, I realized that Natalie was about to learn something she'd never believed, despite all my attempts to explain it over the years. Her failure of a sister hadn't given up or crumbled or lost her edge. She'd just been hiding it. The encrypted phone felt foreign in my hands, like holding a weapon I'd sworn never to use again. 3 years of digital silence, and now the weight of every contact in that device could either save Natalie's life or destroy what was left of mine. I stared at the black screen, knowing that the moment I powered it on fully, I'd be crossing a line I promised myself I'd never cross again. But promises mean nothing when your sister is counting down her final hours. The first call I made was to Elena Vasquez, my former handler at the NSA liaison office. If anyone would know how to track cryptocurrency transactions that sophisticated, it would be her. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, cautious and professional. "This number has been inactive for 3 years," she said instead of hello. "Whoever this is, Raven," I said, using her old call sign. "It's Ghost." The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had dropped. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Jesus Christ, Jade. We thought you were dead. There were rumors. I needed people to think that. Elena, I need a favor. A big one." "Are you out of your mind?" Her voice shot up an octave. "Do you have any idea what happened after you disappeared? The investigation, the paranoia, Jade, there are people who still think you went rogue. People who would kill to know where you are." That stopped me cold. I'd known leaving would have consequences, but I'd assumed that after 3 years, the dust would have settled. What kind of people? The kind that don't like loose ends. The kind that really didn't appreciate you poking around Project Nightfall. Jade, if they know you're alive, if they know you're active again, my sister's been kidnapped. The words came out harder than I intended. $50 million ransom. Professional job. I need to trace a cryptocurrency wallet, and I need to do it fast. Another long silence. When Elena finally spoke, I could hear her making the same calculation I'd made, the same impossible choice between safety and family. Send me what you have. I'll see what I can do. But Jade, this is the last favor. After this, we never spoke. I understood. Helping Ghost meant risking everything Alana had built in the 3 years since I'd vanished. Her career, her safety, her life. But she was willing to do it anyway because, once upon a time, we'd saved each other's lives more times than either of us could count. The next call was harder. Marcus Chen. No, wait, I couldn't use that name. Different story. The next call was to someone I'll call River, a freelance intelligence contractor who existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal, between government and civilian. River owed me for a job in Bucharest that had gone sideways, and he's the kind of person who always pays his debts. Well, well, River's voice was exactly as I remembered. Smooth, amused, dangerous. The ghost rises from the dead. I figured you'd either been liquidated or had found yourself a nice quiet life somewhere. I found a quiet life, now I need to make some noise. Of course you do. It's never social calls with you people. I could hear him typing in the background, probably already running traces on my call. What do you need? Information. Someone took my sister, and they know things about me they shouldn't know. I need to find out who's been asking questions about Jade Sterling. The typing stopped. Jade Sterling? Your civilian identity? Fuck, Ghost. That's not good. That's not good at all. I know. No, I don't think you do. River's voice lost all traces of humor. 3 weeks ago, someone reached out to me asking about you, specifically about your family connections. I told them to go to hell, obviously, but if they were asking me, they were asking others too. The room felt like it was closing in around me. Who was asking? Someone with serious resources and zero sense of humor. They knew about your MIT background, your Pentagon work, even knew about that little side project you did in Tehran. Professional enough to know how to ask the right questions, smart enough to know who to ask. Did you get a name? Got better than that. Got a digital fingerprint. They were using some serious anonymization, but I managed to trace the inquiry back to a shell company called Meridian Solutions. Ring any bells? Meridian. Like Meridian Financial, where Natalie worked. That couldn't be a coincidence. Send me everything you have on them. Already compiling it, but Ghost, whatever you're planning, be careful. Whoever these people are, they've been planning this for a while. This isn't a crime of opportunity. This is a chess game, and they've been moving pieces for months. I ended the call and stared at my laptop screen, watching files download from River's secure server. Bank records, corporate filings, personnel lists, all from Meridian Solutions and its parent company, Meridian Financial. The same company where my sister had worked for the past 2 years. The same companies whose simple cybersecurity issues she'd asked me to help with last month, the same request I'd brushed off because I was too afraid of exposure.
The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. Natalie hadn't been kidnapped randomly. This wasn't about money. $50 million was pocket change to the kind of people who could plan an operation this sophisticated. This was about me, about Ghost, about whatever I'd seen in those government servers 3 years ago that had made me run. Someone had used my sister as bait, counting on exactly what had happened, that I'd come out of hiding to save her. They'd studied my psychology, my weaknesses, my pressure points. They knew that Ghost might stay hidden forever, but Jade Sterling would always try to save her family. I was walking into a trap. Elaborate, carefully constructed trap that had taken months or maybe years to set up. Every instinct I developed during my years in intelligence was screaming at me to run, to disappear deeper, to sacrifice Natalie if necessary to protect the greater secret I carried. But as I stared at the ransom video, at my sister's terrified face, I realized that some choices aren't really choices at all. I'd spent 3 years hiding because I was afraid of what would happen if the wrong people found me. Now the wrong people had found me anyway, and they were using the one person in the world I couldn't abandon as leverage. I opened my laptop and began typing. Not the simple code I'd been writing for flower shops and local businesses, but the kind of code that could tear through digital barriers like they were made of paper. The kind that could turn the entire internet into my personal surveillance network. They wanted Ghost. They were about to get her. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They thought they were the hunters, and I was the prey. They had no idea that by taking Natalie, they'd just woken up something far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. Something that had spent 3 years learning patience, planning, and preparing for exactly this kind of war. The countdown on the ransom video showed 67 hours remaining, more than enough time to show them why they should have left the Sterling sisters alone. The Meridian Financial Building rose 37 floors above downtown Millbrook, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun like a digital fortress challenging me to breach its walls. I sat in my Honda Civic across the street, laptop balanced on my knees, watching the stream of employees leaving for their lunch breaks. Somewhere in that building were the answers I needed, and I was about to commit my first felony in 3 years to get them. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was walking into. The initial penetration was almost insultingly easy. Meridian Financial's external security was corporate standard, impressive to shareholders, pathetic to someone who'd spent years breaking through military-grade encryption. Their wireless network had the usual enterprise protections: WPA3 encryption, MAC address filtering, network segmentation. It took me exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds to map their entire digital infrastructure from the parking lot. What I found made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath the standard corporate network was a secondary system that definitely wasn't designed for managing investment portfolios. Military-grade encryption, air-gapped segments, data flows that looked more like intelligence-gathering protocols than financial transactions. This wasn't just a cover operation. It was a fully functional intelligence hub disguised as a mid-tier financial firm. And Natalie had been working here for 2 years. I pulled up the employee directory, cross-referencing it with the intelligence databases I'd memorized during my Pentagon days. Jonathan Reeves, Senior Vice President, former CIA operations officer, officially retired, but whose retirement had coincided suspiciously with several black budget increases. Catherine Torres, head of IT security, former NSA systems analyst with a specialty in behavioral pattern recognition. Marcus Thornfield, CEO, no official intelligence background, but 3 shell companies connected to his name that had contracts with defense contractors. My sister hadn't just stumbled into a job at a financial company. She'd been recruited into a front operation, and I was willing to bet she had no idea what she was really part of. The question was, had they targeted her because of me, or had they discovered the connection afterward? I activated one of my custom network infiltration tools, a piece of software I'd written during my Pentagon days that could slip through corporate firewalls like digital smoke. Within minutes, I was browsing their internal servers looking for any mention of Sterling, Ghost, or Project Nightfall. What I found was worse than I had imagined. There was an entire folder dedicated to me, not Jade Sterling, the failed government employee, but Ghost, the Pentagon hacker. Personnel files, psychological evaluations, mission reports that were supposed to be classified beyond top secret. They knew about Bucharest, about the Kremlin hack, about the time I'd prevented a cyber attack on our power grid by infiltrating the attacker's network and turning their own weapons against them. But the file that made my hands shake was labeled Subject Acquisition Protocol, Family Leverage. They'd been watching Natalie for 8 months. Every coffee shop visit, every gym session, every date with her boyfriend, Trevor. They'd mapped her entire routine, identified her vulnerabilities, even analyzed her relationship patterns to determine the most effective psychological pressure points. And at the bottom of the file was a single line that made everything clear. Subject demonstrates maximum protective response to family unit. Sister relationship identified as primary leverage. They'd taken Natalie not for ransom money, to force me out of hiding. The $50 million was just theater, designed to make me think this was about wealth when it was really about me. They wanted Ghost, and they'd turned my sister into bait to get her. But why? What could they possibly want that was worth this elaborate setup? The answer was in the final file. Project Nightfall. Asset recovery.
My breath caught. Project Nightfall. The government backdoor I'd discovered 3 years ago. The one that had forced me into hiding. Apparently my disappearance hadn't ended their problems. If anything, it had made them worse. According to the files, the back door I'd found was just the tip of the iceberg. Someone had been systematically compromising government systems for years, selling access to foreign intelligence services, military contractors, corporate espionage operations. The breach I'd discovered had been part of a massive network that stretched through every level of the defense and intelligence communities. And the only person who'd ever seen the full scope of the operation was Ghost. The files showed that, in the 3 years since I'd vanished, they'd been trying to plug the holes I'd identified, but it was like trying to stop a flood with bandages. Every system they secured revealed 2 more that had been compromised. Every breach they closed showed evidence of deeper penetration. They needed someone who understood the full architecture of the attack, someone who could trace it back to its source and eliminate it completely. They needed the hacker who'd found it in the first place. But there was a problem. Ghost had disappeared, and Jade Sterling was just a broken former government employee who built websites for flower shops. They needed me to admit who I really was, to voluntarily step back into the world I'd fled from, and they'd figured out exactly how to make that happen. Take my sister, force me to use my real skills to save her, document every technique, every method, every capability I used in the rescue operation, then leverage that evidence to force me back into government service, whether I wanted to come or not. It was brilliant, ruthless, and exactly the kind of long-term strategic thinking that had made me paranoid enough to disappear in the first place. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my car seat, watching the Meridian building glitter in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in there, the people who'd orchestrated this entire operation were probably watching feeds from my sister's prison, waiting for me to make my next move. They'd studied my psychology, mapped my capabilities, predicted my responses with the kind of accuracy that came from years of professional intelligence analysis. But they'd made one crucial error in their calculations. They'd assumed 3 years of hiding had made me soft, that Jade Sterling's quiet life had somehow diminished Ghost's capabilities. They thought they were dealing with a former government hacker who'd been out of the game too long to be a real threat. They had no idea that Ghost hadn't been hiding for 3 years. She'd been learning, studying, preparing. While they'd been analyzing my old methods and capabilities, I'd been developing new ones, techniques that weren't in any government database because I'd invented them in my tiny apartment, testing them on systems they didn't even know existed. They wanted to see what Ghost could do. They were about to find out that the woman who'd disappeared 3 years ago was nothing compared to what she'd become in the shadows. I started the car and pulled away from the Meridian building, but not before deploying a small piece of surveillance software into their network. They thought they were watching me, but now I was watching them too. Every email, every phone call, every movement through their building would be recorded, analyzed, and stored. The hunt had begun, and they'd just discovered they weren't the only predators in this game. The attacks began at 3:47 a.m. I was deep in code, tracing financial transactions through 17 different cryptocurrency exchanges, when every screen in my apartment went black simultaneously. Not a power outage. The LED strips around my ceiling were still glowing. My coffee maker was still humming in the kitchen. This was targeted. This was personal. When the screens flickered back to life, there was a message waiting for me in bright green text against a black background, like something out of a 1980s hacker movie. "Hello, Ghost. We know you're watching. Time to talk." Below the message was a video feed that made my stomach drop. Natalie's still tied to the same chair, but now she looked worse, exhausted, scared. A man in a dark suit stood behind her, his face obscured by shadows. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His voice was calm, educated, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I hope you've been enjoying your little investigation into our operations. We've certainly been enjoying watching you work. Such elegant code, such sophisticated infiltration techniques. It's almost like you never left the game at all." I started typing furiously, trying to trace the signal, but it was bouncing through so many proxies and VPNs that it might as well have been coming from the moon. "Oh, don't bother," the man continued, as if he could see my screens. "We're using some of your own techniques against you. Did you really think we'd spend 3 years studying Ghost without learning a few tricks? We know about your custom routing protocols, your signal obfuscation methods, even that delightful little backdoor you installed in the Treasury Department systems before you disappeared." That stopped me cold. The Treasury backdoor was something I'd never documented, never reported, never told anyone about. It was my insurance policy, a way to access critical financial intelligence if I ever needed to disappear completely. The only way they could know about it was if they'd been monitoring my activities in real time during my final weeks at the Pentagon. "Surprised?" the man chuckled. "You shouldn't be. Did you really think your little investigation into Project Nightfall went unnoticed, Miss Sterling? We've been watching you far longer than you realize, Miss Sterling. We watched you discover our operation. We watched you try to report it. We even watched you make the decision to run."
Natalie lifted her head slightly, and I could see her mouth moving. She was trying to say something, but no sound was coming through. "Your sister has been asking about you," the man said conversationally. "She seems quite confused about why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths to capture her. She keeps insisting that you're just a failed programmer who builds websites for small businesses. It's really quite amusing." He leaned down closer to Natalie, and I could see her flinch. "She has no idea that her boring little sister once hacked into the Chinese Ministry of State Security and stole their entire database of American intelligence assets. She doesn't know that you prevented a Russian cyber attack on our power grid by infiltrating their command structure and turning their own weapons against them. She certainly doesn't know that you discovered the largest intelligence breach in American history." The man straightened up and looked directly into the camera. "But we know, Ghost. We know exactly who you are and what you're capable of. The question is, are you going to use those capabilities to save her, or are you going to let your sister die to protect your precious anonymity?" The feed cut to another camera angle, showing Natalie from the side. There was something attached to her chair, a small device with a digital readout that was counting down. 58 hours, 34 minutes, 12 seconds. "In case you're wondering," the man's voice continued over the new image, "that's not just a timer. It's connected to several other devices in the room that would make her final moments quite unpleasant. But I'm sure someone with your skills can figure out how to disarm it, if you're willing to come out and play." The screens went black again, then returned to my normal desktop. But the message was clear. They weren't just holding Natalie hostage. They were daring me to prove I was still Ghost, to use the skills that would expose me completely. I spent the next hour methodically securing my systems, changing encryption keys, rerouting my internet connection through a dozen new proxies. But even as I worked, I could feel them watching. Every keystroke, every command, every defensive measure I took was probably being recorded and analyzed. They wanted to see me work. They wanted documentation of my current capabilities, proof that I was still the legendary hacker they needed to solve their Project Nightfall problem, and they were willing to kill my sister to get it. My secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Elena. "They hit our servers an hour ago. Professional job, military precision. Took specific files related to your old cases, but left everything else untouched. Someone's building a portfolio on you." Another message, this one from River. "Word is spreading that Ghost is active again. Price on your head just went from theoretical to very real. Several parties interested in having a conversation with you."
I stared at the messages, realizing that my investigation into Meridian Financial had triggered something bigger than just this kidnapping. By breaking cover, even slightly, I'd sent ripples through the intelligence community. People who'd assumed I was dead or permanently out of the game were suddenly scrambling to locate me. But the most unsettling message came from an unknown number. Your coffee order this morning was a double espresso with oat milk, no sugar. You sat at the corner table and worked on your laptop for 47 minutes. You're very careful with your digital security, but your physical security needs work. A friend. I hadn't left my apartment for coffee in 2 days. Someone was inside my routine, close enough to know details about my daily life. Either they had surveillance I hadn't detected, or someone I'd interacted with recently wasn't who they claimed to be. The barista who'd seemed nervous, the delivery driver who'd asked too many questions, the maintenance worker who'd shown up to fix a problem I'd never reported. They were closing in from multiple angles: digital attacks to test my technical capabilities, psychological pressure through Natalie's captivity, and now physical surveillance to eliminate my escape routes. This wasn't just a kidnapping anymore, it was a full-spectrum intelligence operation designed to capture or eliminate Ghost permanently. I pulled up the video of Natalie again, studying every detail of the room where they were holding her. Industrial location, concrete walls, high ceilings. The sound quality suggested a large space, probably a warehouse. The lighting was artificial but inconsistent, which meant windows or skylights. And in the background, barely audible, was a sound I recognized: the low rumble of freight trains. Millbrook only had one active rail yard, and it was surrounded by abandoned warehouses that would be perfect for this kind of operation. I could narrow it down to maybe 12 locations, but any attempt to reconnaissance them physically would expose me to their surveillance teams. Unless I didn't go myself. I opened a secure connection to a network I'd hoped never to access again: the freelance contractor database that River maintained. Dozens of former intelligence operatives, military specialists, and professional criminals who worked for cash and asked no questions. People who could do in-person surveillance while I continued my digital investigation. But hiring contractors meant using cryptocurrency, which meant financial transactions that could be traced. Every move I made to save Natalie was creating more evidence of Ghost's return, more proof of my capabilities, more ammunition they could use to force me back into the game permanently. They designed the perfect trap. Every step I took to save my sister was another step deeper into their web.
The video call request came at 6:23 p.m., just as I was coordinating with 3 different contractors to surveil the warehouse district. The caller ID showed Mom, but I knew this wasn't a social call. My mother had been trying to reach me for the past 2 days, ever since Natalie's office had reported her missing. I'd been avoiding her calls, focusing on the rescue operation. But apparently my absence had triggered exactly the kind of family emergency I'd been dreading. "Jade, thank God!" My mother's voice was strained, exhausted. Behind her, I could see our family's living room in Millbrook Heights, the same beige walls and family photos that had made me feel trapped since childhood. "We need to talk. Now!" "Mom, this isn't a good time. Make it a good time." Her tone was sharp, the same voice she'd used when I was 16 and caught sneaking back into the house after midnight. "Your sister is missing. The police have no leads, and you've been completely unreachable. Do you have any idea what we're going through?" I glanced at my secondary monitor, where 3 different data streams were tracking my contractors' movements through the warehouse district. In 12 minutes, they'd have visual confirmation on the first 2 locations. "I know about Natalie. I'm working on it." "Working on what? Jade, you build websites. What could you possibly be working on that would help find your sister?" There it was. The dismissal I'd heard my entire life. The assumption that little Jade, with her computer skills, couldn't possibly be useful in a real crisis. Even now, with my sister's life hanging in the balance, my mother couldn't conceive that I might actually be capable of helping. "I have resources. Contacts from my old job." "Your old job?"
My mother's laugh was bitter. Jade, you had a nervous breakdown and quit. The only contact you've maintained from that disaster is your therapist. That stung more than it should have. For 3 years, I'd let my family believe that version of events because it was safer than the truth. I'd let them think I was broken, fragile, incapable of handling pressure. I'd endured their pity and disappointment because it protected them from the reality of who I really was and what kind of danger my true identity could bring to their doorstep. But now that danger had found them anyway. Mom, you don't understand. No, you don't understand. Her voice rose, and I could see tears starting to form. Your sister is gone. Someone took her, and we don't know if she's alive or dead or hurt or scared. And while the rest of us are falling apart, you're sitting in your little apartment acting like you have some kind of secret plan that's going to magically fix everything. The call waiting signal chimed. One of my contractors had found something. But I couldn't take the call, couldn't abandon this conversation, because I could see my mother was spiraling in exactly the way I'd feared. The police asked about you. They wanted to know if Natalie had any siblings, any family members who might be targets. Do you know what I told them? I told them you weren't a factor, because you don't have the kind of life that attracts that kind of attention. Another time, my secure phone was lighting up with messages I couldn't read while my mother watched. I told them my eldest daughter is a sweet, quiet girl who's never hurt anyone, who builds websites for flower shops and lives alone with her cat. I told them you weren't important enough to kidnap. The words hit like physical blows. Not important enough. After everything I'd done, everything I sacrificed, everything I'd given up to protect this family, my own mother had told the police I wasn't worth kidnapping. And now, she's crying openly now they're asking why you won't come in for questioning. They want to interview family members and you keep making excuses. They're starting to think you're hiding something. I was hiding something. I was hiding everything. But how could I explain that coming in for police questioning would create a paper trail that would lead exactly the wrong people directly to my location? How could I tell her that every minute I spent in a police station was a minute I wasn't working to save Natalie's life? Jade, I need you to be honest with me. Is there something about your past, about your work, that could have put Natalie in danger? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. She was asking, finally, if there was more to her strange, reclusive daughter than met the eye. Part of me wanted to tell her everything, about Ghost, about the Pentagon, about the fact that I was probably the only person in the state capable of finding Natalie before the countdown reached 0. But before I could answer, my father appeared in the background of the video call. He looked older than when I'd last seen him, grayer, more tired, but his expression was the same mixture of disappointment and concern that I'd been seeing my entire life. Jazz, he said, using the childhood nickname that always made me feel 5 years old again. Your mother's right. If you know something, anything, you need to tell us. This isn't the time for your dramatic privacy issues. Dramatic privacy issues. As if my desperate need for anonymity was just another quirk of my supposedly unstable personality. We called your old supervisor, Colonel Hartwell. We thought maybe he could help. Use some military contacts to look for Natalie. My blood turned to ice. You did what?
We called the Pentagon directory. Found your old department. Colonel Hartwell was very polite, very sympathetic. He said he'd make some calls, reach out to local law enforcement, see if there were any federal resources that might help. Oh, God. Oh, no. Colonel Hartwell, the man who'd forced me out of the Pentagon, who'd covered up my discoveries about Project Nightfall, who'd made it clear that I was too dangerous to keep around, the man who'd probably been hoping I'd stay hidden forever, was now being told exactly where I was and that my family was in crisis. He seemed surprised to hear from us, my father added. Said he'd lost touch with you after your medical leave. Asked a lot of questions about where you're living now, what you've been doing. They just painted a target on my back in neon letters. Every intelligence agency that had been passively monitoring for Ghost's return would now know exactly where to find me. Worse, they'd know that I was emotionally compromised, that my family was my pressure point. Did you give him my address? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Of course we did, Jade. He's trying to help. He said he might need to coordinate with local resources. My secure phone was practically vibrating off the desk. My contractors were reporting visual contact with potential targets. Elena was sending urgent encrypted messages. River was warning me about increased chatter in the intelligence community. And somewhere in a warehouse, my sister had less than 50 hours before whatever device they'd attached to her chair made her final moments quite unpleasant. But I couldn't do any of it while my parents watched me through this video call, expecting their broken daughter to break down and admit she was helpless. "I have to go," I said. "Jade, we're not finished." "Yes, we are." I looked directly into the camera, and for just a moment, let them see something other than the fragile woman they thought they knew. "I'm going to find Natalie. I'm going to bring her home. And when this is over, we're going to have a very different conversation about who your daughters really are." I ended the call before they could respond, but not before I saw the confusion in their eyes. For just a moment, they'd seen something that didn't match their mental image of me. Something that suggested their quiet, broken daughter might not be quite as helpless as they had assumed. The irony was crushing. In trying to protect my family by hiding my true identity, I'd made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack I'd been afraid of. And now, in trying to save Natalie, I was about to expose them to dangers they couldn't even imagine. But there was no choice anymore. The countdown was ticking, my cover was blown, and somewhere in the shadows, people far more dangerous than kidnappers were closing in on my location. Time to stop hiding. Time to show everyone exactly what Ghost could do when her family was threatened. The attack came at exactly midnight, like they'd been waiting for the symbolic moment when one day died and another began. Every device in my apartment, laptop, phone, smart TV, even my coffee maker, suddenly displayed the same message. "Time's up, Ghost. No more hiding." But this wasn't just a message, it was a demonstration. My custom-built security system, the one I'd spent 3 years perfecting, was being dismantled piece by piece in real time. I watched helplessly as my encrypted drives were accessed, my secure communications intercepted, my backup systems compromised one after another. Whoever was doing this wasn't just breaking through my defenses, they were showing me exactly how they were doing it, like a masterclass in digital destruction. The worst part was recognizing my own techniques being used against me. The intrusion pattern was elegant, surgical, almost artistic in its precision. I'd seen this methodology before. In fact, I'd pioneered some of these approaches during my Pentagon days. Someone wasn't just using advanced hacking techniques. They were using my advanced hacking techniques, improved and refined beyond anything I'd originally developed. A new video feed opened automatically on my main monitor. Natalie was still in the same chair, but now she wasn't alone. A woman in a dark suit stood beside her. Someone I didn't recognize, but whose posture screamed military training. Behind them, a man operated what looked like a mobile command center. Multiple screens, satellite equipment, enough hardware to coordinate a small war. "Hello, Jade." Or should I say, "Hello again." The voice made my blood freeze. It was calm, professional, and utterly familiar. I had heard that voice in Pentagon briefings, in secure communications, in the encrypted channels where Ghost's missions were coordinated. The camera angle shifted, and I could see the woman's face clearly for the first time. Dr. Sarah Blackstone, former Pentagon cybersecurity director, the woman who'd recruited me straight out of MIT, who'd trained me, who'd been my mentor for the first 2 years of my government career. The woman who'd disappeared 6 months before I discovered Project Nightfall. Surprised to see me? Dr. Blackstone smiled, and it was the same warm expression I remembered from 1,000 training sessions. I should explain. You see, I didn't disappear, Jade. I evolved, just like you did. She gestured to the equipment around her. When you discovered our little Project Nightfall operation, you assumed it was some kind of rogue element, some corruption that had infected the system. You never considered that it might be the system working exactly as designed.
The words hit me like physical blows. Dr. Blackstone hadn't been a victim of whatever conspiracy I'd uncovered. She'd been running it.
3 years, she continued conversationally. 3 years we've been cleaning up the mess you made when you went public with your concerns. Do you have any idea how many operations you compromised? How many assets we had to burn? How many partnerships we had to rebuild? She walked closer to Natalie, who was staring up at her with confused terror. Your sister is remarkably naive, by the way. 2 years working at Meridian Financial, and she never suspected that her job interviews, her performance reviews, her entire career trajectory was being managed to keep her exactly where we needed her? She's been our insurance policy, Dr. Blackstone explained. We knew that eventually the problems you'd identified would require your specific expertise to resolve. We also knew that Ghost would never voluntarily return to government service. But Jade Sterling would do anything to protect her family. On my secondary monitor, alerts were flooding in from every direction. My contractor network had been compromised. All 3 operatives I'd hired were now displaying signal lost status. River's secure server had gone dark. Elena's emergency contact protocols were returning dead signals. In less than an hour, they'd systematically eliminated every resource I'd been relying on. We've been very patient, Dr. Blackstone continued. We could have taken Natalie years ago, but we needed to wait until the Project Nightfall situation became critical, until the security breaches you'd identified had grown into something that threatened national security, until fixing them became more important than maintaining your comfortable anonymity. She produced a tablet and held it where I could see the screen. It was showing a map of the United States with red indicators scattered across it like a digital infection. 47 critical infrastructure systems, power grids, water treatment facilities, military communications networks, financial trading platforms, all compromised by the same vulnerability matrix you discovered 3 years ago. The red indicators were pulsing, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't just showing compromised systems, they were showing active attacks in progress. The foreign intelligence services that gained access through our little Project Nightfall operation have been very busy, Dr. Blackstone said. They've been patient, methodical, building their presence in our critical systems for years. And now, she tapped the tablet and several of the red indicators turned amber, then orange. Now they're moving to the active phase. A new window opened on my screen showing news feeds from across the country. Power outages in 3 major cities. Trading halts on 2 stock exchanges. Communication blackouts affecting military bases in 5 states. It was happening in real time, a coordinated cyber attack on American infrastructure that was already underway. We estimate we have less than 48 hours before they move to the final phase, Dr. Blackstone said. Complete system shutdowns, power grids, financial networks, emergency services, military communications. The kind of attack that would send us back to the 19th century overnight. She leaned down closer to Natalie, who was now crying quietly, and the only person who fully understands the vulnerability architecture they're exploiting is currently pretending to be a freelance web designer in a studio apartment. My hands were shaking as I typed, trying to trace the attack patterns on the map, trying to understand the scope of what I was seeing. But even as I worked, I could feel the weight of the trap closing around me. They weren't just threatening my sister anymore. They were threatening the entire country. And they were doing it using the same security flaws I'd tried to warn people about 3 years ago. The choice is simple, Jade. Return to government service. Help us stop an attack that you're uniquely qualified to prevent. Do the job you should have been doing for the past 3 years instead of hiding from your responsibilities. She stood up and walked back toward the camera. Or watch your sister die while your country burns, knowing that both tragedies could have been prevented if you just accepted your place in the larger picture. The video feed cut to a split screen. On one side, Natalie tied to her chair with that countdown timer, now showing less than 46 hours. On the other, a real-time map of the United States showing critical infrastructure systems failing one by one as I watched. But there was something else in the video that Dr. Blackstone probably didn't realize I could see. In the reflection on one of her command center screens, I caught a glimpse of something that changed everything. Coordinates. Geographic positioning data that revealed exactly where they were broadcasting from. Warehouse 47 in the Millbrook Industrial District, less than 6 miles from my apartment. They'd made a crucial error. In their eagerness to show me the scope of the national crisis, they'd revealed their location. And while they'd been talking, I'd been doing more than just listening. I'd been analyzing their digital signatures, mapping their network architecture. identifying the systems they were using to coordinate this entire operation. Dr. Blackstone thought she held all the cards. She thought she'd eliminated all my resources, cornered me completely, left me with no choice but to surrender. She had no idea that in the past 3 years, I'd developed capabilities that went far beyond anything I'd had access to during my Pentagon days. Techniques that weren't in any government database because I'd invented them in secret, tested them on systems that officially didn't exist. They wanted Ghost back? They were about to discover that the woman they'd trained had become something far more dangerous than anything they'd ever imagined. The countdown on Natalie's timer read 45 hours, 53 minutes, but I wasn't thinking about surrendering anymore. I was thinking about war.
The first thing I did was disappear. Not physically. I was still in my apartment, still hunched over my keyboards in the blue glow of multiple monitors. But digitally, I erased myself from every network they'd been using to track me. In 47 seconds, I became a ghost in the machine they'd spent weeks infiltrating. Every backdoor they'd installed, every monitoring protocol they'd established, every digital tripwire they'd set, gone. The second thing I did was turn their own surveillance network against them. For 3 years, while they'd been studying my old techniques, I'd been developing something they didn't know existed, a distributed attack framework that could coordinate thousands of compromised devices simultaneously. Every smart TV, every security camera, every internet-connected device within a 50-mile radius became my eyes and ears. If Dr. Blackstone wanted to play psychological warfare, she was about to learn that the student had surpassed the teacher. But the third thing I did was something that would have been impossible during my Pentagon days. Something that required resources I'd built in secret, capabilities I'd developed without government oversight or limitation. I hacked the Pentagon. Not the obvious systems, not the ones they'd expect ghosts to target. I went deeper, into the administrative networks that managed personnel files, psychological evaluations, and security clearances. Into the databases that tracked who had access to what, when they'd used that access, and what they'd done with it. What I found made everything clear. Dr. Sarah Blackstone's personnel file showed a career trajectory that didn't match my memories. According to the official records, she'd never been my mentor. She'd never recruited me from MIT. She'd never worked in the cybersecurity division at all. Her entire history had been rewritten, scrubbed clean of any connection to the operations I remembered. But digital records are like archaeological layers. You can overwrite the surface, but traces of the original data persist in backup systems, archive files, and cached databases. And I knew where to look. The real Dr. Blackstone had been recruited by the CIA 15 years ago, not as a cybersecurity expert, but as a psychological operations specialist. Her job wasn't protecting American computer systems, it was manipulating the people who operated them. She'd been planted in the Pentagon specifically to identify and recruit hackers who could be turned into assets. Hackers like me. The Project Nightfall operation wasn't about selling access to foreign intelligence services. It was about creating the appearance of selling access while actually feeding those services false information, manipulated data, and carefully crafted intelligence designed to misdirect their operations. A massive counterintelligence operation that used our own infrastructure as bait. But something had gone wrong. The foreign services had detected the deception and turned it back against us. Instead of receiving false intelligence, they'd gained real access to our systems. Instead of being manipulated, they became the manipulators. The hunters had become the hunted. And when I discovered the breach 3 years ago, I'd stumbled into the middle of an intelligence disaster that was already spiraling out of control. The genius of their current operation was becoming clear. They needed someone to fix the Project Nightfall disaster, but they couldn't officially acknowledge that the disaster existed. So they'd created an elaborate scenario to force me back into service while maintaining plausible deniability. If anyone asked, this was just a family crisis that had revealed my capabilities, not a deliberate recruitment operation. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. While I'd been digging through their files, my distributed surveillance network had been mapping their entire operation. Every communication node, every command center, every piece of equipment they were using. What I found was that their 47 critical infrastructure attacks weren't random targets. They were specifically chosen systems that would create maximum public panic while causing minimal actual damage. This wasn't a foreign cyber attack. This was a false flag operation designed to justify emergency powers, increase surveillance, and the kind of intelligence programs that had created Project Nightfall in the first place. My sister was being held hostage, not to force me to stop an attack, but to force me to participate in one. They wanted Ghost's capabilities not to defend America, but to attack it in a way that would serve their agenda. I opened a new terminal window and began typing code that I'd hoped never to use. Not the elegant, surgical techniques I'd developed for intelligence gathering, something older, more primitive, more destructive. The kind of digital weapon that left scorch marks instead of subtle infiltrations. If they wanted to see what Ghost could do when her family was threatened, they were about to get a demonstration they'd never forget. My first target was their command center's power grid, not the backup systems or the battery arrays, the primary electrical infrastructure that fed power to the entire industrial district where they were holding Natalie. I didn't just want to shut off their lights. I wanted to show them that their supposedly secure location was completely vulnerable to someone with my capabilities. The power went out in Warehouse 47 at exactly 2:17 a.m. 30 seconds later, it came back on. But that 30 seconds was enough to send a message. I know exactly where you are, and your defenses are meaningless. My second target was more personal. Dr. Blackstone's personal devices, her phone, her tablet, her encrypted communication gear. I didn't just hack them, I made them scream. Literally. Every speaker in her equipment began emitting a high-pitched whine that would be audible throughout the warehouse, the kind of sound that would make concentration impossible and coordination difficult. But my third target was the masterstroke that would change everything. I hacked into the Pentagon's own internal monitoring systems and triggered every security alert simultaneously. Cyber intrusion detected in 17 different networks, unauthorized access to classified databases, potential data breach and progress across multiple military installations. The kind of alert that would wake up every cybersecurity specialist in the Department of Defense and send them scrambling to identify the threat. Except the threat wasn't a foreign attacker. It was me, documenting every piece of evidence I'd found about the false flag operation, the manipulated infrastructure attacks, and Dr. Blackstone's psychological operations background. Evidence that would be automatically logged, time-stamped, and distributed to dozens of senior officials before anyone could stop it. Within minutes, my secure phone was exploding with incoming calls. Elena, River, 3 different Pentagon officials whose names I recognized from my old briefings. But the call that mattered came from a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. Colonel Hartwell's direct line. Sterling. His voice was sharp, urgent, and completely different from the dismissive tone I remembered. What the hell is happening? We've got alerts across 17 networks, and every attack signature is pointing to techniques that were classified beyond top secret. Techniques that were supposed to be locked down after you left. "Hello, Colonel," I said calmly. "I see you've been having some infrastructure problems tonight. Funny how these things happen right when you need them to justify emergency measures." The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. He was aware of the operation, maybe not fully briefed, but aware enough to understand the implications of what I'd just said. "You need to stand down," he said finally. "Whatever you think you're doing, you're operating on incomplete information. There are national security implications you can't understand from your position." "My position?" I laughed, and there was no humor in it. "Colonel, you have no idea what my position is, but you're about to find out." I ended the call and opened one final application,
A piece of software I'd written but never deployed, something so advanced that it existed more as theoretical concept than practical tool. It was time to show them that the woman they'd tried to manipulate had become something far beyond their ability to control or contain. Time to show them what Ghost looked like when she stopped hiding and started hunting. The software I was about to deploy didn't have an official name. During development, I'd called it Pandora, because once opened, it couldn't be closed. It was an autonomous penetration system that could breach any network, adapt to any defense, and replicate itself across unlimited targets. The kind of digital weapon that could start a cyber war or end one, depending on who controlled it. I'd built it as insurance during my final months at the Pentagon, when I'd started to suspect that my own government might become my enemy. Now, 3 years later, that paranoia was about to prove justified. But before I unleashed Pandora, I needed to make one thing absolutely clear to everyone watching. Ghost wasn't just back, she was better than she had ever been. The Pentagon's main cybersecurity network was protected by 17 layers of encryption, quantum randomized firewalls, and intrusion detection systems that could identify and neutralize threats in microseconds. It was supposed to be impenetrable, the digital equivalent of Fort Knox. I broke through all 17 layers in 30 seconds. Not by finding vulnerabilities or exploiting backdoors, but by rewriting the fundamental architecture of their defense systems in real time. I turned their own security protocols against themselves, made their firewalls ignore my presence, convinced their intrusion detection systems that I was an authorized administrator running routine maintenance. But that was just the warm-up. My real target was something that officially didn't exist. The classified database where they stored psychological profiles of intelligence assets, the files that contained every detail about Ghost's capabilities, limitations, psychological pressure points, and behavioral predictions, the information they'd been using to manipulate me for 3 years. What I found in those files was worse than manipulation. It was character assassination on a digital scale. According to my official psychological profile, I was unstable, paranoid, and potentially dangerous. The file described me as someone who'd suffered a complete breakdown when confronted with classified information beyond my security clearance, someone who'd fled government service because I couldn't handle the pressure of real intelligence work, someone whose current isolation was evidence of severe social anxiety and possible dissociative disorders. But buried beneath the official assessment were the real evaluations, the ones written by people who'd actually worked with me. Dr. Martinez from the MIT recruitment program. Exceptional analytical capabilities, unprecedented intuitive understanding of digital systems, natural leadership potential. Colonel Stevens from my first Pentagon assignment. Most effective cyber warfare specialist I've encountered in 20 years of military service. General Williams from the Joint Chiefs Briefing. Strategic thinking that consistently exceeds expectations, recommend immediate advancement to senior analysis position. They'd systematically replaced every positive evaluation with fabricated negative ones. They'd rewritten my entire professional history to support the narrative that I was a failed intelligence officer rather than one who'd discovered their illegal operations. But the most damaging file was labeled Family Leverage Assessment. It contained detailed psychological analyses of my relationships with Natalie, my parents, even my college roommates. Complete behavioral profiles designed to identify how to manipulate me through the people I cared about. And at the bottom, a chilling recommendation. Subjects' protective instincts towards family unit represent optimal leverage point for asset control. They hadn't just been watching my family for months. They'd been watching them for years. Every job Natalie had applied for, every man she dated, every major decision she'd made had been influenced by their manipulation. Her position at Meridian Financial wasn't just surveillance, it was social engineering on a massive scale. As I read through the files, my anger transformed into something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about saving Natalie anymore. This was about exposing a system that had turned psychological manipulation into an art form.
that had weaponized family relationships to control intelligence assets. I opened Pandora. The software spread through Pentagon networks like digital wildfire, copying files, documenting evidence, creating an unalterable record of everything I was discovering. But it didn't stop there. It began reaching out to other government networks, other intelligence databases, other classified systems where similar psychological operations might be documented. Within minutes, Pandora had infiltrated the CIA's operational files, the NSA's personnel databases, the FBI's counterintelligence records. It was building a comprehensive picture of a psychological manipulation program that extended far beyond Project Nightfall, far beyond my own case. They'd been doing this to dozens of intelligence assets, identifying family members, mapping emotional vulnerabilities, creating leverage points that could be activated when needed. Ghost wasn't special. I was just one target in a systematic program designed to maintain control over anyone with capabilities they considered valuable. But while Pandora worked in the background, I had more immediate concerns. My distributed surveillance network was showing movement at Warehouse 47. 3 black SUVs had arrived, and tactical teams were deploying around the perimeter. Dr. Blackstone was evacuating her command center, probably realizing that her supposedly secure location had been completely compromised. They were moving Natalie. I pulled up satellite imagery of the warehouse district and began tracking the vehicles as they left. 2 headed toward the interstate, decoys, probably empty or carrying equipment. But the 3rd took a different route, staying within the city limits, heading toward the Millbrook Medical Center. That made terrible sense. A hospital would provide cover for moving a hostage, legitimate reasons for medical equipment that could conceal the countdown device, and built-in security systems that would make rescue operations complicated. They were adapting their strategy, moving to a location where any attempt to save Natalie would risk civilian casualties. But they'd made a crucial error in their tactical thinking. They were still operating under the assumption that I was the same ghost they'd studied 3 years ago, someone who would be limited by concerns about collateral damage, someone who would hesitate to take actions that might harm innocent people. They had no idea that I'd spent 3 years developing techniques specifically designed to operate in populated areas without endangering civilians. Methods that could isolate targets with surgical precision, that could distinguish between hostiles and innocents at the digital level. My secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown number. Impressive display, but ultimately pointless. We're relocating to a position where your sister's safety depends on your cooperation. Any aggressive action will result in civilian casualties you can't prevent. You have 12 hours to surrender yourself to Colonel Hartwell's custody. Failed to comply, and we activate the device. SB. Dr. Blackstone was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to make this about my psychological limitations rather than my capabilities. She thought moving to a hospital would force me to surrender because I wouldn't risk innocent lives. She was about to learn that Ghost had evolved far beyond anything their psychological profiles could predict. I opened a new terminal window and began typing code that would make my Pentagon infiltration look like a warm-up exercise. Not just hacking into the hospital systems, but rewriting them completely. Taking control of every computer, every monitoring device, every piece of networked equipment in the entire medical complex. If they wanted to use a hospital as their fortress, they'd just given me access to the most sophisticated surveillance and control network in the city. Every security camera would become my eyes, every intercom system would become my voice, every connected device would become my weapon. But more importantly, every system that monitored patient care would allow me to ensure that no civilians were harmed during the operation I was planning. I could isolate individual rooms, redirect staff away from danger zones, even control the building's life support systems to protect innocent people while targeting only the hostiles. They thought they'd chosen a position that would limit my options. Instead, they'd given me home field advantage in the most networked building in the city. The countdown timer in Natalie's video feed now showed less than 11 hours. But I wasn't thinking about surrender anymore. I was thinking about something Dr. Blackstone had said during her first video message. Any attempt to contact law enforcement will result in her immediate execution. She'd assumed I would want to contact law enforcement. She never considered that by the time I was finished, law enforcement would be contacting me. At 4:47 a.m., I owned the entire city of Millbrook. Not just the hospital where they were holding Natalie, not just the government networks I'd infiltrated, but everything. Traffic management systems, cell towers, power grids, water treatment facilities, emergency services dispatch centers, even the digital billboards on the interstate. Every networked device in a 40-mile radius was now part of my distributed command structure. But that wasn't the revelation that changed everything. The revelation came when Pandora finished analyzing the psychological manipulation files and presented me with a pattern I hadn't expected. The Family Leverage Program wasn't just about controlling existing intelligence assets, it was about creating them. They'd been identifying talented individuals and then systematically engineering crisis situations that would force those individuals into government service. My MIT roommate, who joined the NSA after her brother was arrested on fabricated drug charges. My college research partner, who accepted a Pentagon position after his family's business was mysteriously bankrupted by federal regulations. The cybersecurity specialist I'd trained with, who'd been recruited after her sister was kidnapped by terrorists, who turned out to be intelligence contractors.
I wasn't the victim of an elaborate recruitment operation. I was the prototype. For 15 years, they'd been perfecting the techniques they'd first tested on me. The psychological profiling, the family vulnerability mapping, the crisis manufacturing. All of it had been refined through dozens of other cases. They'd turned psychological manipulation into a reproducible system for acquiring and controlling intelligence assets. But as I traced the pattern through the files, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The program had a name, Operation Mindbridge. And, according to the classified budget documents, it was scheduled for massive expansion. They weren't just targeting a few dozen exceptional individuals anymore, they were scaling up to recruit thousands of assets using these techniques. The infrastructure attacks happening across the country weren't just a false flag operation to force me back into service. They were a field test for a new phase of psychological manipulation. By creating a national crisis, they could justify emergency recruitment of cybersecurity specialists, each one brought into service through manufactured personal emergencies that would ensure their loyalty and compliance. My case was the proof of concept. If they could break Ghost and force her back into service, they could break anyone. I was staring at the blueprint for the systematic psychological enslavement of America's most talented hackers, programmers, and cybersecurity experts. A program that would give the intelligence community unprecedented control over the digital battlefield by ensuring that every specialist with critical capabilities was personally invested in government service through manufactured family trauma. But while I'd been processing this information, something had been happening on my surveillance network that demanded immediate attention. The tactical teams surrounding the hospital weren't just securing the perimeter, they were installing equipment. Signal jammers, communication interceptors, and what looked like portable EMP generators positioned around the building. They were preparing to cut off my digital access to the hospital entirely. Dr. Blackstone had realized that my capabilities exceeded her psychological models, and she was adapting her strategy. If she couldn't control me through manipulation, she'd isolate Natalie completely and force a physical confrontation on terms that favored her tactical teams. But she'd made a crucial miscalculation in her timing. While her teams had been setting up their electronic warfare equipment, I'd been rewriting the hospital's entire network infrastructure, not just accessing it, but fundamentally altering how it functioned. Every device, every system, every piece of equipment was now running modified firmware that reported to my servers while appearing to function normally to anyone monitoring it locally. When they activated their signal jammers, they cut off external communications to the hospital. But they didn't cut off the internal network, because that would have shut down critical patient care systems. And that internal network was now completely under my control, operating as an isolated digital environment where I had absolute authority. The irony was perfect. In trying to isolate me from their operation, they'd isolated their operation from everything except me. I opened a new video call interface, not to receive their transmissions, but to broadcast my own. Every screen in the hospital,
Patient monitors, administrative computers, nurse station displays, even the television screens in waiting areas suddenly showed the same image. My face looking directly into the camera with the kind of calm confidence that comes from holding every advantage. Dr. Blackstone, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. I could see her through the security cameras, standing in what had been the hospital's main conference room, surrounded by her tactical teams and electronic equipment. She was staring at the nearest monitor with an expression that mixed surprise with growing alarm. You've made several assumptions about my capabilities that I'd like to correct. First, you assumed that 3 years of hiding had made me weaker. Actually, it gave me time to develop techniques that your psychological profiles never anticipated. On every screen, I displayed a real-time map of the hospital with heat signatures showing the location of every person in the building. Dr. Blackstone's team members were highlighted in red, hospital staff in blue, patients in green. Second, you assumed that bringing this operation to a hospital would limit my options due to civilian safety concerns. Actually, it gave me access to the most sophisticated monitoring and life support network in the city. I zoomed in on Natalie's location, a private room on the 7th floor, where she was still strapped to that chair with the countdown device. But now I could see additional details through the hospital's own medical monitoring systems, her vital signs, stress levels, even the specific type of explosive device they'd attached to her chair. Third, I said, watching Dr. Blackstone's face through the security cameras, you assumed that I would eventually break under psychological pressure and surrender to save my sister. You built your entire operation around the idea that family loyalty would override rational strategic thinking. I paused, letting the silence build tension. You were wrong about that, too. The screens throughout the hospital changed to show a live feed from the main conference room where Dr. Blackstone was standing. Now everyone in the building could see her, could hear what was about to happen. Dr. Blackstone, you're under arrest for violation of federal laws regarding psychological manipulation of intelligence personnel, conspiracy to commit terrorism through false flag operations, and kidnapping. But more importantly, you're about to become a demonstration of what happens when someone threatens a sterling family member. I activated systems throughout the hospital that she didn't even know existed. Emergency lockdown protocols that sealed every exit, fire suppression systems that could flood specific rooms with inert gas, climate control systems that could create precisely targeted environmental conditions, and most importantly, the building's own security systems, which were now completely under my control.
You wanted to see what Ghost could do, I said, as magnetic locks engaged on every door leading to the conference room. You wanted to document my capabilities for your psychological manipulation program. The countdown timer on Natalie's device showed 8 hours and 17 minutes, but I wasn't looking at that anymore. I was looking at the real-time feeds from 17 different government agencies that Pandora had connected to this broadcast. Pentagon officials, NSA directors, FBI cybersecurity chiefs, even members of congressional intelligence committees were all watching this unfold in real time. Consider this your final lesson, I said, as every piece of electronic equipment in the conference room began to shut down systematically. When you build a trap for someone, you'd better make sure you're not standing in it when it closes. The last thing Dr. Blackstone saw before her screens went dark was my smile, the same expression she'd given me during all those Pentagon training sessions when she'd thought she was molding a useful asset instead of creating her own nemesis. Now it was time to save my sister and end this psychological manipulation program permanently. The rescue took exactly 30 seconds. Not because I rushed, but because I'd spent the previous 8 hours rewriting every system between me and my sister. By the time I walked through the front doors of Millbrook Medical Center, the building itself had become an extension of my will. Every elevator, every door lock, every security camera responded to my commands before I even had to give them. I didn't sneak in through back entrances or disable alarm systems. I walked through the main lobby at 6:30 a.m. like I owned the place. Because, digitally speaking, I did. The automatic doors opened for me, the security desk computer logged me as an authorized federal agent conducting an emergency operation. The elevator arrived before I pressed the call button and took me directly to the 7th floor without stopping. But the real demonstration of what Ghost had become wasn't the technical mastery. It was what happened when I reached Natalie's room.
She was exactly where my surveillance network had shown her, strapped to a medical chair in what had been converted into a makeshift holding cell. The countdown device was still attached, showing 6 hours and 43 minutes remaining. But she wasn't alone. 2 tactical operatives were stationed in the room, both armed, both positioned to have clear shots at the door. They'd expected me to attempt some kind of elaborate infiltration, probably through ventilation systems or maintenance shafts. They hadn't expected me to simply walk in the front door. "Don't move," the first operative said, raising his weapon. "Federal agents, you're under arrest for—" I held up my hand, and every electronic device in the room shut down simultaneously. Their radios went dead, the lights flickered off, then back on. The countdown device's display went dark for 3 seconds, just long enough for everyone's heart to stop, then resumed its countdown. I could have disabled that device permanently just now. I could have triggered it instantly. I could have locked you in this room and flooded it with nitrogen gas. I could have done about 100 different things that would have ended this conversation before it started. The second operative reached for his backup radio. It turned on, but instead of his command frequency, it began broadcasting my voice. "This is Ghost. I'm currently in room 717 of Millbrook Medical Center, where I've just encountered 2 individuals who appear to be impersonating federal agents while holding my sister hostage. The reason I haven't done any of those things is because, unlike the people you work for, I don't believe in solving problems by traumatizing innocent people." I knelt beside my sister's chair and looked at the countdown device. It was more sophisticated than I had expected, not just a timer but a complex electronic system with multiple fail-safes and tamper detection protocols, the kind of device that required genuine expertise to disarm safely. Fortunately, I'd spent the past 6 hours analyzing its digital signature through the hospital's own equipment. Every electromagnetic emission, every radio frequency, every electronic component had been mapped and categorized. I knew exactly how it worked. More importantly, I knew exactly how to turn it off. "Jade?" Natalie's voice was hoarse, exhausted, but underneath the fear was something I'd never heard before. Not dismissal, not condescension, but genuine awe. "You are exactly who I tried to tell you I was," I said, placing my hands on the device. "I'm the sister who's been protecting this family for years, even when you didn't believe I could protect anything." The device had 17 different security protocols designed to prevent tampering. I bypassed all of them in 43 seconds, not by finding vulnerabilities, but by convincing the device's own control systems that I was an authorized technician performing routine maintenance. As the countdown timer went dark and the restraints around Natalie's arms clicked open, I heard something that made this entire ordeal worthwhile. My sister crying. Not from fear or relief, but from understanding. For the first time in our lives, she was seeing me clearly. "The computer skills. You really are," she whispered as I helped her stand. "A former Pentagon cybersecurity specialist who once prevented a major terrorist attack by hacking into enemy command systems. A government contractor who spent 3 years in hiding because I discovered an illegal psychological manipulation program. And your sister, who would burn down the entire internet to keep you safe." The tactical operatives were backing toward the door, but they weren't fast enough. Every exit from the room sealed automatically, magnetic locks engaging with audible clicks that echoed through the hallway.
"You're not going anywhere," I said without looking at them. "In about 30 minutes, FBI cybercrime specialists are going to arrive here to take you into custody. They're going to have some very interesting questions about your involvement in a conspiracy to manipulate intelligence personnel through manufactured family emergencies." My secure phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "Federal task force en route to your location. Operation Mindbridge files have been distributed to appropriate oversight committees. Dr. Blackstone and her team are in federal custody. You're officially back on the right side of this." But the message that mattered came from an unknown number with government encryption. "Ms. Sterling, this is Director Sarah Chen of the FBI Cybercrime Division. Based on the evidence you've provided about Operation Mindbridge, we're opening a full investigation into psychological manipulation of intelligence personnel. We'd like to discuss your potential role as a consulting specialist in dismantling this program. Compensation and security guarantees to be negotiated." I looked at Natalie, who was staring at my phone with an expression of complete bewilderment. "The FBI wants to hire you?" "Not hire," I said, helping her toward the door as the magnetic locks disengaged. "Consult. There's a difference."
We walked through the hospital corridors that I'd controlled for the past 8 hours, past conference rooms where Dr. Blackstone's tactical teams were being processed by federal agents, past monitoring stations where my surveillance network was being documented by cybersecurity specialists who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. In the main lobby, Colonel Hartwell was waiting with 2 other Pentagon officials and what looked like a small army of federal investigators. When he saw me, his expression was complicated, part relief, part professional respect, and part fear of someone whose capabilities had exceeded every projection. "Sterling," he said formally, then paused, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I owe you more than apologies, but we can discuss that later. Right now, I have a family reunion to attend." As we reached the parking lot, Natalie stopped walking and turned to face me. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Always." "When you said you hacked the Pentagon in 30 seconds, you were serious?" I pulled out my phone and showed her a real-time view of Pentagon network traffic with complete administrative access to systems that were supposed to be unhackable. 27 seconds, actually. I was being modest. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression I'd been waiting my entire life to see. Not dismissal, not condescension, but genuine recognition of who her sister really was. "Computer skills," she said quietly, and for the first time there were no air quotes. "Computer skills," I agreed. As we drove away from the hospital, my phone exploded with messages from government agencies, private contractors, cybersecurity firms, and news organizations who'd somehow gotten wind of what had happened. Everyone wanted to talk to Ghost, to hire her, to understand how someone had taken control of an entire city's digital infrastructure and used it to expose a massive intelligence conspiracy. But the message that made me smile came from my mother. "Jade, we saw the news reports. We don't understand everything that happened, but we understand that we were wrong about you. We're sorry, we're proud, and we'd like to have dinner soon so you can explain exactly what our daughter does for a living." "So," Natalie said, as we pulled into my apartment complex, "what happens now? Do you go back to building websites for flower shops?" I looked at my laptop bag, thinking about the software tools that could reshape digital warfare, the government contracts that would probably be offered, the cybersecurity consulting firm I could build with the reputation I'd just established. "No," I said, "I think Ghost has work to do." And for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't talking about hiding.